Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Today's story is about love, betrayal, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Join us as we follow Mark and Sarah on their journey through the trials of infidelity, the pain of lost trust, and the courage it takes to rebuild a relationship from the ground up. It's a story of second chances, resilience, and finding hope even in the darkest moments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to start today's story. Let's dive into life stories. Life often unfolds in rhythms of quiet routine, moments that blend seamlessly into one another, shaping the days, months, and years of a life shared. For Mark and Sarah, their 7-year marriage had become a symphony of comfortable familiarity. Their home in Willow Creek, Illinois, a cozy haven tucked away under a canopy of oak trees, was a place that spoke to their shared love for peace and simplicity. Mark, with his career in downtown Chicago, and Sarah, dedicated to her art and their home, had built a life together that many would envy. Evenings were spent over home-cooked meals, their laughter filling the kitchen, while weekend mornings often began with coffee and newspapers sprawled on the living room couch. Yet, beneath the surface of this domestic harmony, something had begun to shift. Mark felt it in the quiet moments, the spaces between the laughter and the touch. There was a restlessness he couldn't quite name, a subtle dissonance in the melody of their life. It wasn't that he loved Sarah any less, he adored her gentle smile, the way she would hum absent-mindedly while painting, and her unwavering support for his ambitions. But there was a part of him, hidden even from himself, that felt unfulfilled. This undercurrent of unease started small, almost imperceptible, a missed conversation here, a distracted glance there. But over time, it grew. Mark would find himself staring out the window of his office in Chicago, his thoughts wandering far from the life he had built. It wasn't dissatisfaction, it was more like a yearning, a longing for something undefined and unspoken. One crisp morning, as Mark sipped his coffee and prepared for another day at the office, the answer to his unease seemed to walk through the door in the form of Laura. Laura was vibrant, her energy radiating through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Her laughter was uninhibited, her ideas fresh and challenging, and her presence invigorating. She was a new hire, someone whose sharp wit and easy charm quickly caught Mark's attention. At first, their conversations were entirely professional, revolving around projects and deadlines. But there was something about her, a spark, a vitality that made Mark look forward to their interactions. Meetings that had once felt tedious now became the highlight of his day. He told himself it was nothing more than a refreshing work dynamic, a simple connection born of shared interests and mutual respect. But deep down, he knew better. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew more personal. They would linger over coffee, discussing books and travel, sharing stories and laughter that lingered a bit too long. Mark found himself drawn to Laura in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. With her, he felt seen, understood in ways he hadn't realized he craved. It wasn't that Sarah didn't understand him, she did, more than anyone ever had. But with Laura, there was a newness, an excitement that felt intoxicating. The guilt was immediate and sharp. Every evening, when Mark returned home to Sarah, the weight of his emotional betrayal pressed heavily on his chest. Her smile, warm and familiar, only deepened the ache. He loved her, of that, he was certain. But there was a part of him that couldn't resist the allure of what Laura represented, a world of possibility, of passion and energy that he feared he might have lost along the way. One evening, as Mark sat across from Sarah at the dinner table, he realized just how far he had drifted. She was recounting her day, her voice soft and steady, and he found himself only half listening, his mind wandering back to the office and the sound of Laura's laughter. It wasn't fair, not to Sarah, not to the life they had built together. But he didn't know how to stop the thoughts that pulled him away from the here and now. It was during a particularly chaotic day at the office that Mark and Laura decided to grab dinner together. It was under the guise of needing to unwind. A harmless dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the office. The dim lighting and quiet atmosphere seemed to cocoon them, creating a space where the outside world ceased to exist. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, Laura shared stories of her travels, her eyes lighting up with memories of far-off places and adventures. Mark was captivated. He shared his own stories, feeling a connection that was both exhilarating and unsettling. As the evening wore on, Mark became acutely aware of the charged air between them. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional pause that felt heavy with unspoken attraction. For a fleeting moment, Mark allowed himself to imagine leaning across the table, closing the space between them. The thought jolted him back to reality, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had nearly done. Driving back to the office in silence, Mark wrestled with his conscience. He knew he was treading dangerous waters, straying ever further from the vows he had made to Sarah. That night, as he returned home, Sarah was waiting up for him, her smile soft and welcoming. The guilt was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to consume him. He kissed her cheek, the familiar scent of her perfume grounding him even as it reminded him of his betrayal. Lying awake that night, Mark stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotions. He loved Sarah, he knew that much. But with Laura, he felt alive in ways he hadn't in years. The duality of his desires left him paralyzed, caught between the life he had built and the life he imagined might be waiting just out of reach. It was a dangerous path, one that he knew could unravel everything if he wasn't careful. And yet, he couldn't seem to turn away. Mark's days began to take on a surreal quality, a balancing act between the life he had with Sarah and the burgeoning connection he felt with Laura. Every morning, as he kissed Sarah goodbye before heading to work, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The guilt was a constant companion, shadowing his every move. Yet, the allure of Laura, her laughter, her presence, the way she seemed to light up every room she entered was intoxicating. At work, their interactions grew more frequent and less restrained. Laura's vibrancy was magnetic, pulling Mark into her orbit. She challenged his ideas with sharp insights, her confidence disarming and captivating. It was a dynamic he hadn't experienced in years, and it left him both exhilarated and unnerved. The energy between them was undeniable. And while they kept their interactions professional on the surface, there was an undercurrent that neither could ignore. Mark told himself it was harmless, a connection that simply made the long workdays more bearable. But as weeks turned into months, the line between professional camaraderie and emotional intimacy blurred. Meetings stretched into long conversations that veered far from the topic at hand, and moments of shared laughter lingered with an unspoken tension. Every interaction with Laura felt like stepping closer to the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath him unstable and treacherous. One evening, as Mark and Laura stayed late at the office to finish a project, the atmosphere shifted. The building was quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights. They were the only ones left, their desks illuminated by the faint glow of their computer screens. As they worked, their conversation drifted from work to more personal topics, childhood memories, dreams for the future, and the paths that had led them to this moment. Laura shared stories about her upbringing in a small town in Oregon, her eyes sparkling as she recounted her adventures hiking in the Cascade Mountains and her dreams of one day writing a book about her travels. Mark found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, sharing stories of his own childhood in the Midwest, his love for photography, and the way he had once imagined traveling the world before settling down in Willow Creek. Their words flowed easily, the barriers between them dissolving with every shared story. As the clock ticked past midnight, they decided to take a break. Laura suggested grabbing a coffee from a nearby diner, and without thinking, Mark agreed. The diner was nearly empty, its neon sign casting a soft glow through the windows. They slid into a booth, the air between them charged with an intensity that neither acknowledged but both felt. Over steaming cups of coffee, they laughed and talked, their voices low and intimate. Mark felt a pang of guilt every time he glanced at his phone. The image of Sarah's face on his lock screen a stark reminder of the life waiting for him at home. But in Laura's presence, that guilt felt distant, muted by the thrill of the moment. It was a dangerous illusion, one he knew he couldn't sustain. Yet, he found himself leaning into it, craving the way Laura made him feel alive, seen, understood. As they walked back to the office, the conversation slowed, replaced by a heavy silence. The unspoken attraction between them hung in the air, palpable and undeniable. Mark's heart raced as they reached the building, the quiet of the night amplifying the tension. For a moment, they stood there, neither moving nor speaking, the weight of their emotions pressing down on them. Finally, Laura broke the silence with a soft smile and a quiet goodnight. Mark watched her disappear into the building, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He knew he was playing with fire, risking everything he had built with Sarah for a connection that, while intoxicating, was fraught with danger. When Mark returned home that night, the house was dark, Sarah already asleep. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her peaceful form under the covers. Guilt surged within him, a tidal wave that threatened to overwhelm him. He loved her, he knew that. But the feelings he had for Laura were real, and they were pulling him further from Sarah with each passing day. As he climbed into bed beside her, Mark felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him. He was caught in a storm of his own making, torn between two worlds, each offering something he desperately needed but couldn't reconcile. The life he had with Sarah was slipping through his fingers, and he wasn't sure he had the strength or the will to hold on. Mark's inner turmoil became an almost constant presence, a quiet hum of anxiety that lingered no matter where he was or what he was doing. At work, he looked forward to moments with Laura, knowing full well how deeply his actions conflicted with his values. At home, the guilt threatened to suffocate him, turning even the most mundane interactions with Sarah into painful reminders of his betrayal. Sarah, though unaware of the depth of Mark's emotional conflict, sensed the growing distance between them. She noticed the subtle changes, his distracted gaze during conversations, the way he seemed less engaged in their shared routines. She chalked it up to stress from work, offering her unwavering support with gentle questions about his day and attempts to ease his burden. But Mark's responses were evasive, his words lacking the warmth that had once defined their bond. One Saturday morning, as they sat together in the living room with their coffee, Sarah asked him about a trip she'd been considering, a weekend getaway to Lake Geneva. She hoped it might rekindle the spark that had been missing in their relationship. Mark hesitated, fumbling for an excuse about work commitments and deadlines. Her disappointment was visible, though she quickly masked it with a soft smile and a nod. She didn't press him further, but her silence spoke volumes. Mark hated himself for the way he was hurting her. Sarah had been his partner in everything, his anchor through the highs and lows of life. She didn't deserve this, a husband who couldn't seem to find his way back to her, no matter how hard he tried. But no matter how much he loved Sarah, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Laura. It wasn't just attraction, it was a connection that felt electric, invigorating, like rediscovering a part of himself he thought he'd lost. That connection intensified one evening when Mark and Laura stayed late again at the office. It had been a particularly grueling day, filled with back-to-back meetings and urgent deadlines. By the time the rest of the team had left, the two of them were alone, their desks cluttered with empty coffee cups and scattered paperwork. Laura suggested they take a break, and Mark, eager for a reprieve from the weight of his thoughts, agreed. They ended up at a small bar a few blocks from the office, its dim lighting and quiet atmosphere offering a stark contrast to the chaos of their day. Over drinks, Their conversation shifted from work to more personal topics. Laura shared stories of her family, her dreams, and the challenges she had faced in her career. Her openness was disarming, her vulnerability drawing Mark in further. He found himself sharing his own thoughts and fears, speaking more candidly than he had in months. At one point, as Laura laughed at one of his stories, Mark found himself mesmerized by the way her eyes sparkled, the way her laughter seemed to fill the space between them. For a fleeting moment, he forgot about everything else: Sarah, their home, the life he was putting at risk. In that moment, there was only Laura, and the connection that had grown between them. But as the night wore on, the weight of reality began to creep back in. The guilt Mark felt was nearly unbearable, and he struggled to reconcile the man he wanted to be with the choices he was making. When Laura suggested they call it a night, he felt a mixture of relief and regret. Walking her back to her car, the air between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Mark hesitated, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't bring himself to voice. "Good night, Mark," Laura said softly, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. She smiled at him, a quiet, knowing smile, before slipping into her car and driving away. Mark stood there for a long moment, watching her taillights disappear into the night. His heart was pounding, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of guilt, longing, and confusion. He knew he was at a crossroads, teetering on the edge of a decision that could either save his marriage or destroy it completely. When he finally returned home, Sarah was waiting for him, her expression calm but curious. "Late night?" she asked, her voice warm and devoid of suspicion. Mark nodded, offering a vague excuse about work. But as he kissed her cheek and watched her retreat to the kitchen, he felt a pang of regret so sharp it took his breath away. Lying awake that night, Mark stared at the ceiling, his thoughts consumed by the choices he had made and the path he was on. He loved Sarah, he was sure of it. But the feelings he had for Laura were real, and they were growing stronger with each passing day. He was trapped between two worlds, each pulling him in a different direction. And as much as he wanted to believe he could navigate this storm, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too far gone. As the days turned into weeks, Mark found himself sinking deeper into the emotional quagmire of his divided heart. At work, Laura became his sanctuary, someone who understood his thoughts and mirrored his energy in ways that felt almost fateful. Their connection was no longer something he could dismiss as fleeting or inconsequential. It had become a significant part of his life, though one cloaked in secrecy. Meanwhile, at home, the cracks in his marriage with Sarah began to widen. Sarah, though still kind and attentive, seemed to grow quieter as the weeks passed. Her once effortless conversations with Mark were now hesitant, as though she was tiptoeing around a fragile truth she didn't yet have the words to confront. She still prepared his favorite meals and asked about his day, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Mark couldn't bear to meet. One evening, after another long day at work, Mark came home to find Sarah sitting on the couch, her knees tucked under her as she read a book. She looked up when he walked in, her smile faint but warm. "You're home late again," she said gently, her tone free of accusation but heavy with unspoken questions. Mark nodded, mumbling something about a last-minute meeting. He kissed her on the forehead and moved to the kitchen, hoping to escape the quiet tension that had settled between them. As he poured himself a glass of water, he caught his reflection in the window, tired eyes, a furrowed brow, and a heaviness in his expression that startled him. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. In the days that followed, Mark began making excuses to spend more time with Laura outside of work. Their interactions had crossed a line he hadn't dared to imagine just weeks ago. Coffee breaks turned into extended lunches, and professional catch-ups evolved into dinners under the guise of unwinding from stressful deadlines. These moments with Laura were intoxicating, a reprieve from the guilt and unease that had taken root in his life. But each time he returned home, the weight of what he was doing pressed down on him like a physical burden. One Friday evening, Mark and Laura decided to meet for dinner at a quaint Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet street near the office. The ambience was warm and inviting, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. They chose a corner booth, their conversation flowing easily as the dim lighting created an intimacy that felt both comforting and dangerous. As Laura shared stories of her recent trip to the coast, her eyes lit up with excitement, and her laughter rang through the space like a melody. Mark couldn't help but be captivated by her, by the way she seemed to radiate life and joy. She was so different from the version of himself he had come to know lately, weighed down by the monotony of routine and the guilt of his actions. When it was his turn to share, Mark opened up about his own dreams, ones he hadn't voiced in years. He told her about his passion for photography, how he used to imagine capturing the world's beauty through his lens. Laura listened intently, her encouragement and enthusiasm a balm to the doubts that had long since silenced those aspirations. As the evening wore on, Mark felt the pull of Laura's presence grow stronger. The space between them seemed charged, as though the air itself had thickened with the weight of unspoken possibilities. For a fleeting moment, Mark considered leaning across the table, closing the distance between them. The thought was thrilling and terrifying all at once. A stark reminder of how far he had strayed from the man he once thought himself to be. But just as quickly as the thought arose, it was pushed aside by a wave of guilt so profound it left him momentarily breathless. He excused himself to the restroom, splashing cold water on his face and staring at his reflection in the mirror. What was he doing? How had he allowed himself to reach this point? When he returned to the table, Laura seemed to sense the shift in his mood. She smiled softly, her eyes searching his as though trying to understand what had changed. They finished their meal in relative silence, the earlier ease of their conversation replaced by a quiet tension. As they parted ways that night, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. One more step, and there would be no turning back. He knew he had to make a choice, one that would define not just his future, but the lives of the two women he cared about most. When he arrived home, the house was dark, Sarah already asleep. Mark stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long moment, watching her peaceful form under the covers. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him gasping for air. He loved her, he truly did. But he was no longer sure if love alone was enough to bridge the chasm he had created between them. Lying awake beside her that night, Mark felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him with an unbearable intensity. He was torn, trapped between two worlds that offered him pieces of what he longed for but could never fully satisfy. The life he had built with Sarah felt like it was slipping away, and for the first time, he wondered if it was already too late to save it. Mark's internal conflict became more pronounced with each passing day. He found himself replaying the moments with Laura, the conversations, the laughter, the spark that felt so undeniable. But those moments came with a price. A guilt that gnawed at him every time he returned home to Sarah. The home they had built together felt colder now, the warmth of their bond slowly eroding under the weight of his actions. Sarah, though still unaware of the full extent of Mark's emotional betrayal, was no longer able to ignore the growing distance between them. She noticed the small, telling signs, the way Mark seemed more preoccupied than usual, how his phone never left his side, and the subtle shifts in his demeanor. Her attempts to bridge the gap suggesting a weekend getaway, cooking his favorite meals, initiating deeper conversations were met with polite but distant responses. It hurt her more than she could admit, and late at night, she would lie awake wondering if the man she loved was slowly slipping away from her. One evening, after another long day at the office, Mark came home to find Sarah waiting for him in the living room. She had lit a few candles, the soft glow casting a warm light across the room. A bottle of wine sat on the coffee table, 2 glasses already poured. She looked up as he entered, her expression hopeful but tinged with something deeper, a quiet plea he couldn't ignore. "I thought we could have a night to ourselves," she said softly, patting the seat beside her. "It's been a while since we just talked. Mark hesitated, guilt flooding him as he nodded and took the seat next to her. Sarah handed him a glass of wine, her smile tentative. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "Mark," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I feel like I'm losing you. And I don't know why." Her words struck him like a blow. And for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to look at her. When he finally did, he saw the pain in her eyes, the confusion, the hurt, the desperate need for answers. He opened his mouth to speak but found that no words came. What could he say? That she was right? That he had been emotionally unfaithful to her with someone else? Instead, he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Work has just been overwhelming. I didn't mean to make you feel that way." Sarah searched his face, her brow furrowing slightly. She wanted to believe him, to take his words at face value. But something in her heart told her there was more to the story. Something he wasn't saying. Still, she chose not to press him further, her fear of pushing him away overriding her need for clarity. As the days went on, Mark's guilt became a nearly unbearable burden. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, one that threatened to destroy the life he had built with Sarah. But despite his best efforts to distance himself from Laura, he found it almost impossible to stay away. She was a magnet, drawing him in with a force he couldn't resist. It wasn't long before Mark crossed another line he had sworn he wouldn't. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, he found himself at Laura's apartment under the pretense of discussing a work project. The atmosphere was casual at first, but as the evening wore on, the boundaries between them blurred once again. They sat close together on her couch, their conversation flowing easily as laughter filled the room. Then, in a moment of weakness, Mark leaned closer, his eyes meeting Laura's in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still, but just as quickly as the moment arose, Mark pulled back, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had almost done. He muttered an apology, grabbing his coat and leaving before either of them could say another word. As Mark drove home that night, his mind raced with conflicting emotions. He knew he had gone too far, that he was dangerously close to shattering everything he had with Sarah. Yet, the pull he felt toward Laura was undeniable, a force he couldn't seem to escape. When he walked through the door, Sarah was already in bed, her breathing soft and steady. Mark stood in the doorway of their bedroom, his chest tight with regret and shame. He climbed into bed beside her, staring at the ceiling as the weight of his choices bore down on him. He was trapped in a storm of his own making, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could find his way out. The turning point came sooner than Mark expected, though it didn't arrive with the dramatic revelations he had feared. Instead, it crept in quietly, like a slow-burning flame that threatened to engulf everything he held dear. Sarah's intuition, sharpened by weeks of observing Mark's increasingly distant behavior, finally reached a breaking point. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table in silence, the tension between them was palpable. Sarah put down her fork, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but laden with emotion. "Mark," she began, her eyes fixed on him, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." Mark's heart sank. He could feel the air shift around them, the fragile foundation of their marriage trembling under the weight of her words. He nodded, unable to speak. "Is there someone else?" Sarah's voice cracked, her vulnerability on full display. She searched his face for answers, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The question hit Mark like a thunderclap, and for a moment, he was paralyzed by fear. He wanted to deny it, to shield her from the truth that he knew would devastate her. But the look in her eyes filled with a mixture of pain, hope, and desperation made it impossible for him to lie. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "There's someone at work. But it's not, it hasn't gone that far." Sarah's expression shifted, her pain deepening as she absorbed his words. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together as she tried to process the betrayal. "But you thought about it," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You wanted it." Mark reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her movement sharp and deliberate. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. "I love you, Sarah. I always have." Sarah stood, her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to shield herself from the weight of his confession. "You say you love me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you let someone else into your heart. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Mark rose to his feet, his desperation evident in his every movement. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, his voice pleading. "But I want to fix this. I want to fix us." Sarah turned to face him, her expression a mixture of heartbreak and resolve. "I don't know if we can be fixed, Mark," she said. "I don't even know if I know you anymore." The conversation ended there, both of them too overwhelmed by emotion to continue. Sarah retreated to their bedroom, and Mark stayed behind, staring at the empty table as the enormity of what he had done settled over him. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark contrast to the laughter and warmth that had once filled its walls. Over the next few days, their interactions were strained and minimal. Sarah avoided Mark whenever possible, retreating into herself as she tried to make sense of her feelings. Mark, racked with guilt, struggled to find the right words to bridge the growing chasm between them. The house, once a symbol of their love and partnership, felt like a prison, its walls closing in around them. Desperate to make amends, Mark decided to take a bold step. He sought out a therapist, someone who could help him untangle the mess he had made of his life. His first session was raw and unfiltered, a torrent of emotions spilling out as he confessed his infidelity and his fears of losing Sarah. The therapist, a calm and compassionate woman named Dr. Harper, listened intently, her questions probing but not judgmental. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked gently. "What do you truly want, not just for yourself, but for your marriage?" Mark hesitated, the answer caught in his throat. He wanted Sarah. He wanted the life they had built together, the love they had shared before everything fell apart. But he also knew that wanting wasn't enough. He needed to act, to prove to her that he was willing to do the work to rebuild their relationship. That night, as Mark lay awake in the guest room, Sarah having asked him to sleep elsewhere, he thought about what Dr. Harper had said. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing with certainty: he couldn't give up on Sarah. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles in after a storm but before the wreckage is fully understood. Mark felt as though he were navigating uncharted territory, each step a delicate attempt to bridge the growing distance between himself and Sarah. She, in turn, kept her emotions tightly guarded, her interactions with Mark polite but detached. They were like two strangers inhabiting the same space, each unsure of how to find their way back to the other. Mark threw himself into therapy, attending sessions with Dr. Harper twice a week. It became a place where he could untangle the web of emotions and decisions that had led him to this point. He spoke about his love for Sarah, his feelings for Laura, and the restlessness that had driven him to seek something outside of his marriage. Dr. Harper listened patiently, guiding him through his guilt and helping him to confront the deeper truths he had been avoiding. "What do you think is at the root of this restlessness?" she asked during one session. Mark hesitated, running his hands through his hair as he searched for the words. I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that I wasn't enough. That I wasn't the man Sarah deserved. And when Laura came along, she made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years." Dr. Harper nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you've been carrying a lot of self-doubt, she said. But it's important to remember that seeking validation outside of your marriage doesn't address the root of that doubt. It only creates more pain for you and for Sarah. Mark left each session with a mix of clarity and sorrow. The weight of his actions pressing down on him more heavily as he began to understand their full impact. He started making small changes at home, offering to cook dinner, asking Sarah about her day, and taking time to listen. Really listen to her answers. But Sarah remained guarded. Her smiles faint and fleeting. Her responses measured and cautious. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Mark decided to address the tension head-on. "Sarah," he began, his voice tentative, "I know I've hurt you. More than I can ever say. And I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough. But I want you to know that I'm committed to making things right." Sarah looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. "What does making things right even mean, Mark?" she asked. "Because right now, it feels like everything is broken." Mark swallowed hard, her words cutting through him like a blade. "It means doing the work," he said quietly. "It means being the man you deserve, the man I should have been all along. I've started therapy. I'm trying to figure out why I let things get this far and how I can fix them. I know it won't happen overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to discern whether his words were genuine. Finally, she set down her fork and sighed. "I appreciate that you're trying, Mark," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I don't know if I can trust you again. And without trust, what do we even have?" Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and unrelenting. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. But he forced himself to meet her gaze. "I know I broke your trust," he said. "And I know it will take time to rebuild it. But I'm not giving up on us." "Sarah, you mean everything to me." Sarah stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "I need time, Mark," she said softly. "Time to figure out what I want and whether this is something I can even move past." Mark nodded, his heart sinking as she left the room. He knew her words were fair, that she had every right to take the space she needed. But the thought of losing her, truly losing her, was a pain he couldn't bear. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began seeing a therapist of her own. She needed a space to process her emotions, to understand the depth of her hurt and what it meant for her future. Her sessions became a lifeline, a place where she could express the anger, sadness, and confusion she had kept bottled up for so long. Meanwhile, Mark continued to attend therapy, each session peeling back another layer of his psyche. He began journaling, pouring his thoughts onto the page in an attempt to make sense of the chaos within him. He wrote about his love for Sarah, his regret for his actions, and his determination to rebuild their relationship even if it meant starting from scratch. The days were long and the nights longer, but Mark refused to give up. He knew that healing would take time, that the wounds he had inflicted on Sarah and their marriage couldn't be mended with empty promises or grand gestures. It would require patience, honesty, and a level of vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show before. And so, he waited. He waited for Sarah to decide whether their love was worth fighting for, whether the foundation they had built could be salvaged. All he could do was hope that she would see the changes he was making, that she would believe in the sincerity of his efforts, and that, one day, they might find their way back to each other. Mark's days stretched into weeks, the uncertainty of his future with Sarah weighing heavily on him. Yet, amidst the tension, he began to notice small glimmers of hope. Sarah, though distant, seemed to soften ever so slightly. She no longer avoided his gaze entirely, and their brief conversations, while guarded, carried a hint of the warmth that had once defined their relationship. Mark clung to these moments, however fleeting, as evidence that there was still a chance to mend what had been broken. His sessions with Dr. Harper continued to be a cornerstone of his healing process. Through therapy, he began to explore not only his mistakes but also the deep-seated fears and insecurities that had led him astray. It was painful work, confronting the flaws he had spent years burying. But it was necessary. One evening, as Mark sat alone in the guest room journaling, Sarah knocked softly on the door. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside and sitting on the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "About us. About everything." Mark set his pen down, giving her his full attention. "What have you been thinking?" he asked, his voice cautious. Sarah let out a slow breath, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted. "At least, not right now. But I also don't know if I'm ready to walk away from everything we've built." Her words were both a relief and a heartbreak. Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm worth a second chance." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. "I need time," she said finally, "and I need to see that you're committed to change, not just for me, but for yourself." Mark nodded again, his heart aching with the weight of her request. "You'll have it," he promised. "However much time you need." Over the following weeks, they began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, arguments that flared up unexpectedly, and days when it felt as though they were making no progress at all. But there were also moments of connection, small victories that reminded them of what they were fighting for. One such moment came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Sarah was in the kitchen baking cookies, a pastime she had always loved but hadn't indulged in for months. Mark wandered in, drawn by the familiar scent of vanilla and chocolate. He stood in the doorway, watching her as she moved around the kitchen with practiced ease. "Do you need any help?" he asked tentatively. Sarah glanced at him, her expression softening. "You could stir the batter," she said, gesturing toward the bowl on the counter. Mark stepped forward, rolling up his sleeves as he took the spoon from her. They worked side by side, the silence between them companionable rather than strained. When the cookies were in the oven, Sarah leaned against the counter, watching Mark as he cleaned up. "You used to love helping me bake," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. Mark paused, looking over at her. "I still do," he said. "I think I just forgot how much." Sarah's smile grew, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. It was a small moment, but it filled Mark with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt as though they were moving in the right direction. Mark knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was determined to keep walking it, one step at a time. At the end of the day, as they sat together on the couch sharing the still warm cookies, Sarah rested her head on Mark's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Mark wrapped an arm around her, holding her close as the weight of the past few months began to lift. If only slightly. They weren't there yet. Forgiveness would take time, and trust even longer. But for now, they had this moment, a tentative step toward healing, toward hope, toward a future that they might one day rebuild together. Mark and Sarah's journey was one of love, betrayal, and the painstaking process of rebuilding what once seemed irreparably broken. Over time, through shared effort and unwavering commitment, they found a way to heal, not by forgetting the past but by learning from it. Their love evolved into something deeper, rooted in understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. They began to cherish the small moments again, quiet evenings spent cooking together, laughter during family game nights, and the simple joy of holding hands during walks. Their bond grew stronger, fortified by the trials they had faced and the lessons they had learned. Mark's mistakes had left scars, but those scars became reminders of their resilience and capacity to forgive. As they looked toward the future, they did so with hope, knowing that the road ahead would still have challenges. But this time, they faced it together, stronger and more united than ever. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone who might find hope in its message, and subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of love, growth, and second chances. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you for watching.